We're living through a massive global power shift. And if you listen to China's president, it's a kind of change that hasn't been seen in 100 years. What's crazy, though, is that no one expected this historic shift to be sped up, and in so many ways, defined by the moves of one very unpredictable man. Okay, let's get into it. So what this whole story really boils down to is a clash between two leaders with completely different playbooks. I mean, it is hard to imagine two more different styles, right? On one side, you've got Xi Jinping. He's guarded, he's methodical, a guy who absolutely plays the long game. And on the other, Donald Trump, brash, impulsive, and famous for playing the Twitter game. This clash of styles is shaping what is, without a doubt, the most important relationship in the world. And this quote really gets to the core of how China sees things. President Xi says this kind of thing all the time, and it's a huge signal that Beijing sees this moment not as some kind of crisis, but as a massive, historic opportunity. You see, they believe the old US-led order is cracking, and Trump's challenges to that very system are basically opening the door for them to step right in. So how does a country that literally plans in decades deal with a leader who can change his mind in a single tweet? Well, China's policymakers have basically been running a non-stop analysis of Trump. They figured out he's transactional, he's a deal maker, but the one thing they've learned for sure is that he is completely and totally unpredictable. But you know, it's not just the top brass who have an opinion. What's really fascinating is how Trump is seen on Chinese social media. It's this surprisingly complicated and honestly often hilarious take on the former US president. And, of course, the internet has a nickname for this. One of the popular ones is Taco. Trump always chickens out. This popped up because people started noticing that President Trump makes a lot of big threats, but then a lot of them just kind of fade away without anything actually happening. It's this idea that his bark is often way worse than his bite. And then you've got this one, which is just dripping with irony. Chuan Jianguo. It translates to Trump, the nation builder. Now, they don't mean he's building up America. No, the joke is that his actions, picking fights with allies, kicking off trade wars, creating all this instability, are actually helping China rise as a superpower by pushing everyone else a little bit closer to Beijing. Okay, so this all leads us right into the trade war. Trump really tried to land a knockout punch on the Chinese economy, but what he didn't count on was that China would punch back. And not just that, but learn how to play the game, turning what was a direct economic attack into a strategic advantage for themselves. And look, let's be real, that first punch landed hard. China was definitely caught off guard, and its exports to the US dropped by about 20% in just 1 year. It was a huge wake-up call that being so dependent on the American market was a major vulnerability. But this is where China's long-game strategy really kicks in. It made a deliberate pivot away from the US. So while their exports to America were tanking, they shot up nearly 13% to India, over 13% to Southeast Asia, and more than 8% to the EU. And at the end of the day, China actually hit a record trade surplus. They weathered the storm by just going out and finding new customers. But here's the thing, all those tariffs and new trade deals, that's just one piece of the puzzle. China's real leverage, their ultimate trump card in this whole economic fight, is something much smaller and way more critical. We're talking about a group of minerals. And this chart right here, it just perfectly illustrates China's total dominance. We're talking about rare earth elements. Now, China mines over 60% of them, but the real chokehold is in the refining. They refined over 90% of the entire global supply. You see, for decades, other countries just gave up on this industry because of the high costs and environmental issues, which basically left China with a near monopoly. Okay, so why should you care? Because these rare earths are in literally everything that makes our modern world tick. They're essential parts in our iPhones and electric cars, but also in critical military gear like fighter jets and missile guidance systems, not to mention green tech like wind turbines. By controlling this supply chain, Beijing has the power to cause some serious pain to global manufacturing anytime it wants to. So all of this stuff, the trade war, the unpredictability, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's sending ripples all across the globe. As the United States starts to be seen as a more, let's say, unreliable partner, it creates a power vacuum. And for Beijing, that vacuum is a golden opportunity. And this leads to a phenomenon experts are calling the global hedge. It's pretty straightforward, really. It starts with this perception of the US as an unstable force. What happens next? You see this flurry of Western leaders jetting off to Beijing, trying to build a more complex relationship. They aren't necessarily picking China's side. Instead, they're hedging, building ties with both superpowers so they don't get caught in the crossfire. But here's the twist. For all these big strategic wins on the world stage, China can't completely paper over some really serious problems brewing back home. Playing the long game has come with some major domestic costs, and now there are deep cracks appearing in the very foundation of its economic miracle. I mean, for years, China's growth engine was all about borrowing and building. But a lot of that investment created this massive overcapacity. Local governments and companies just built way too much stuff, leading to things like bridges to nowhere, these gigantic infrastructure projects that have very little actual economic value. And you can see this most clearly with real estate. You have developers just loaded up on debt, building entire cities that are now pretty much empty. These ghost towns are a stark, concrete symbol of an economy that basically built more than anyone could ever possibly need, and it's all leading to a massive debt crisis. And the fallout from all this? It's hitting hard. Beijing has set its lowest GDP growth target since 1991. All that overcapacity has created deflation, that's falling prices, right at home. For the first time ever recorded, fixed asset investment, we're talking money spent on things like land and buildings, has actually declined. Workers are facing pay cuts and layoffs, and now China is basically exporting its deflation by dumping cheap goods on the global market, which is complicating things with the very same countries it's trying to get closer to. So, where does all of this leave us? Well, we're smack in the middle of a historic superpower standoff. It's a long game being played by two very different powers, and honestly, the outcome is nowhere near certain. China is absolutely making strategic gains, but it's also dealing with immense pressure from within. So let's be crystal clear about where things stand right now. The United States is still, by far, the world's biggest economy and has the most powerful military. Is China an equal? The answer, for now at least, is still no. But it is gaining ground, and it's doing it in a world that is changing faster than ever before. And that leaves every other country in the world with a really tough choice. You know, hedging might be the smart play for now, but as this rivalry gets more and more intense, it brings up a huge question for everyone else. When two superpowers are locked in a fight for the future, can anyone really afford to stay on the sidelines?